Hey there guys, my name is Brandon from Gearist.com and welcome to this episode of Ask Gearist. Today's question comes to us from Mo, and Mo asks, thanks so much for putting this series together. I'm a new cyclist and looking to compete in my first triathlon in 2015. Do you have any suggestions or tips on how to most efficiently use the gears on my road bike to help with the performance? Right now, I have one gear that I feel comfortable in and just stay there for my entire rides. I know I'm probably working my legs harder than I should be in spots and not enough in other spots. Help! Thanks so much for the question, Mo. That's a really common one that a lot of people have and are really kind of uncertain about. So with this episode of Ask Gearist, what we're going to do is break down the basics of bicycle shifting, what the parts are, what the terminology is, and how to most efficiently shift your bicycle. Now before we get into the actual art of shifting, let's talk about some of the parts that are on your bike and what you need to know as they pertain to shifting. First up, this right here is your cockpit. This is what you see when you're behind the handlebars of your road bike. Now we're not going to get into the handlebar width thing and all that kind of stuff. We're just going to talk about what pertains to shifting today. Now on the left hand side, that shifter right there houses your shifting for the front derailleur and also for your front brake. Now on the right hand side, that shifter takes care of your rear brake as well as your rear cassette or rear derailleur. A good way to remember what's what when you get onto your bicycle so you're not like which one of these controls which is right hand rear. That's always a way that you can remember that whatever you're doing in your right hand is going to influence what happens on the back side of the bike. The basic way that a shifter works, and for the sake of today's video we're going to be talking about Shimano shifting, is that you've got two basic parts to your shift lever. Now here you can see a Shimano shifter. The parts that you'll notice on that first are the hood. That's this thing here. That's where your hands rest when your hands are kind of out there on the hoods. The second thing you're going to notice is the basic brake lever. Now that serves two purposes. The first is obviously to power the brakes. The second is that moves to the side. It's on a swivel point. Now if you're using the right hand, what that's going to do is as you move that, each click you shift that over, that's going to move the chain up the cassette. Remember, this is right hand in the rear. It's going to move you up the cassette and make that gear a little bit easier. That's upshifting. Now, behind that, you can see a smaller lever. That smaller lever, for each click of that, is going to move you down the cassette. That's going to make it harder. The same is true on the left hand, but kind of opposite. If you're going from the small gear or a smaller gear to a bigger gear, you're going to be shifting up by pushing the big lever inward and then back down to the easier gear with the smaller lever that you see behind the brake lever. Now on your bike, you're going to see a series of cables coming from your shifters, and depending on the way that your bike is set up, whether it has external or internal cabling, those cables are going to run back to their designated parts. In other words, from the left-hand shifter, there are going to be cables that are going to run one to the brake up front and the other to the front derailleur. Likewise, with the right hand, you're going to have one that runs to the rear brake and one that runs to the rear derailleur. These cables in concert with the shifters are what make these parts move. Moving on back now, this right here is an illustration of the drivetrain of a bicycle. It's pretty generic, there are no cables involved. It's just for the sake of this video right here. Now what you can see is that here is the front derailleur and here is the rear derailleur. You can also see the front chain rings and you can also see the rear cassette. And finally, just in case you've never ridden a bike before, that thing that goes around both those rings, that's called the chain. Now let's start with the chain rings up front. First of all, they are called chain rings. Most bikes are either going to have 2 or 3. In the case where there are 3, generally speaking, the smallest of those chain rings, which is going to be the one closest to the bike or inside, that's going to be called granny gears. It's no offense, it just makes it really, really easy to pedal up pretty much any. You could pedal up the side of like the Hancock building in Chicago in that gear and you'd be probably okay. All gears on a bicycle are going to be designated by the number of teeth that are on them. Now, on the front chain ring on, for instance, the bike that I ride, there's a 5339. You'll hear people throw around numbers like that, 5339 or 5236 if it's compact or something like that. You'll hear people throw these different names around, and what that means is that the number of teeth on the large ring that we see here, and in this illustration I haven't counted, I'm just saying that if this were 5339, it's got 53 teeth, and then the inner ring is going to have 39 teeth on it. That also applies to the rear gears that we're going to talk about in a second. Now the chain rings are obviously attached to your crank arms. The crank arms and the chain rings together make your crank set. They are what drive the bike with pedals on the end, obviously. Now let's move back to the rear cassette. Now, here's something that you may have heard when you were a kid, and you may still be using this terminology today, is that, oh, I have a 21 speed bike, or I have this many speeds on my bike. This is the terminology that road cyclists are going to use. We don't count the front, we count only the back. So if you've got 10 speeds on the back, you have a 10-speed bike, not a 30-speed bike if you have 3 gears up front and 10 in the back. It's just a 10-speed bike or an 11-speed. Most of the time it's going to be 10 or 11. Every now and then you can find a 12-speed, but that's kind of rare, and sometimes 9. Now the set of gears or cogs that's on the back of the bicycle is called your cassette. Now that cassette is also going to have a range of teeth classifications. Now sometimes it's going to be like an 1128, which is on the compact that I ride. Sometimes you're going to have something like a 1227. It really all depends. And again, what that means is that the smallest ring on the cassette, the smallest cog, is going to have 11 teeth if it's an 1128, and the largest is going to have a 28 teeth on it. And so there's different spacing in between there. That doesn't really matter. It's whatever feels right to you. So make sure that you're on a good kind of wide-ranging cassette that's going to allow you to climb and allow you to roll some flats and downhills without spinning out of gears, and I'll talk about what that means in a few minutes. Now the next thing that we're going to talk about is terminology. If you've ever driven a manual transmission or stick shift car, then you're probably familiar with how you shift when you approach different parts of terrain. So while we're talking about this, if you have driven a stick shift or manual transmission car, kind of keep that in the back of your head because it'll really help some of your understanding of bicycle shifting as well. The first thing is that when I say up and down shifting, what I mean is if you're up shifting, you're going into a harder gear. So in a car, it would be like going into 4th or 5th gear. Now, this is what you're going to use when you're going downhill or something like that. If you're going uphill, we're going to downshift into a easier gear where you're asking the engine, which is you, the engine doesn't have to put out quite as much power or effort to get up this hill or up this particular piece of terrain because the gearing allows the ratio to be such that it's easier for you to turn the pedals and thus get up the hill more efficiently. Another term we're going to talk about in a second is cross-chaining. We're going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of shifting in a minute, but cross-chaining is pretty easy to understand. It basically means that if you're in the biggest gear up front and the smallest gear in the back, you're really going to be stressing the hardware because the chain is supposed to be like this and you're asking it to be really spread apart. It's big gear up front, small gear in the back, or vice versa. Anytime you've got the chain operating at opposite ends of itself, you're really going to kind of stress that chain and the hardware itself a little bit. You can, if you're under force or under load, you can actually really bend a derailleur or something, a derailleur hanger, which is going to mess up your entire drivetrain, and trust me, is very expensive to repair. The last piece of terminology that I'll bring up that you heard me say a second ago is a load-bearing shift. What this basically means is if you have waited to go up a hill and you're actually already going up the hill a little bit and your cadence is slowed down and you shift under load, in other words, you're really putting the screws to that gear, you're really kind of putting some force on it, that type of thing is a good way to chip a tooth, drop a chain, anything like that. You don't want to do that. So make sure you anticipate things, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in a second. Now let's talk about when to shift. There are 3 basic types of terrain that you're going to deal with: uphill, downhill, and flat. Now, when you're on a flat, stay wherever you're comfortable. This plays into cadence a little bit, so I like to have my legs going at about 95 to 100 RPMs. This is definitely subjective, and as you become more comfortable on your bike, your cadence is probably going to climb a little bit. Most people are comfortable spinning a lower gear, and that is, generally speaking, the way that a lot of people ride. You can, of course, see people back in the day like Jan Ullrich, who's kind of like a big diesel engine, a much slower cadence, but he's also putting out a lot more power. It's not as efficient going up hills and things like that, but it is still a ton of power. But more efficient can also equal the same amount of power output over time. You're just having more pedal strokes. So what does this mean for your shifting? Well, here's the basic primer. When you're approaching a hill and you see it coming, what you should do is, when you're about to get to the hill, do not wait until you've started to slow down. When you're about to approach the hill, then you should downshift. Begin to get into something easier, at least 1 gear easier, because once you've started up that hill, number 1, you're going to, like I mentioned a second ago, compromise the hardware in some situations. And number 2, you're going to run out of gears. It's very difficult to shift in a situation like that, and your legs aren't going to be ready for it. So when you see a hill coming, make sure that you go ahead and get into a lower gear, or even 2 lower gears if it's a super steep hill. That way, when you're shifting, even if it's under a little bit of load, it's a smaller increment to shift rather than having to get down from 1 gear to 3 gears below that because it's stressing your legs too much. And quite frankly, you're going to start rolling backwards if you don't. Another time you're going to want to hang out in a lower gear, whether it's on a flat or a hill, is when you have a big headwind. This is a wind that is in your face. It's okay to go slow. When you're getting fit on the bike or learning to ride, one of the most important things is riding consistently. So don't really pay so much attention to pace. Pay more attention to the effort that you're putting out and pay more attention to the power that you're putting into the pedals and your cadence. These are the things that are going to be important, and in the long run, they'll pay much bigger dividends than just kind of forcing yourself through the wind. Now let's talk about going downhill. With downhills or with a tailwind, the opposite of headwind when a wind is coming from behind you, you obviously have a lot more freedom and it's actually a lot easier. So that's when you get into the biggest gear you can. Get that big ring going and that small cog in the back and just really rip on it, because this is your opportunity to really fly down a hill or fly with the wind. Again, really focus on keeping your cadence where it is, but this is a great time where you can really play around with that big ring and feel some of that power. Shifting under a load or something like that is not obviously a big deal when you're going downhill or anything where you've got a lot of assistance from the wind or something like that, because again, you're not going to be putting a load to it and you can always just coast out of it. So not as big a deal as when you're going uphill. Now, as for flats, this is actually a very interesting situation and something where I would recommend finding where you're most comfortable. A lot of flats, you're going to have what are called false flats. There's going to be either a little slight downhill that doesn't feel or look like one, or likewise, you're going to have a small uphill, which is more commonly what's referred to as a false flat. This is where you're like, why am I working so hard? This is flat. Well, probably not flat. You're probably going uphill and you just don't know it, and that's okay. Just really maintain your power output and your cadence and you'll be fine. In my opinion, the biggest thing with when to shift is really following your instincts with what it feels like and anticipating shifts. If you're riding in a group of people, especially with more experienced riders, it's a really good idea. If you see some guy or girl shift that's much more experienced than you, you should probably go ahead and shift too. But it's also okay to ask them questions. Hey, why did you shift right there? Don't be afraid to ask questions. That's how we learn. That's what this series is all about. The last thing I want to touch on is how you learn. Now, I've given you all these things in abstract. You're watching a YouTube video, for crying out loud. How do you put these things into practice? Here's the simplest way. It's to get yourself on your bike. Find a nice piece of road that's pretty rolling, not something that's got super steep hills or super big downhills, just something that's flat to rolling. This is going to give you a nice even terrain where you can play around with things. The second thing is to get into that, either if you've got granny gears, a triple up front, or you've got a double up front, get into the lower gear on a double or the middle gear on a triple, and really stay right on that gear up front and just shift around using your cassette. That would be using the right hand shifter. Shift around using that. Find what works. Work it into your body that you're like, I know exactly what's happening. I know where I'm shifting. I know what I'm supposed to do next. I upshift here, I downshift here. I'm going up a hill. I need to make the gears easier. Getting into one single gear and just playing with the cassette is going to be what you're going to need to do, because that cassette is what you're going to be playing with most of the time. The big chain rings up front, those are for big changes. It's like in a car. Again, going from first gear to fifth gear, you're going to stall out. Don't worry about it. So you need to figure out exactly how you're going to manipulate that to best fit your body. One little tip is that very roughly, each shift up front equals roughly 3 shifts in the back. So if you're going from the middle chain ring or the small chain ring to the big chain ring, that's roughly the same as going 3 shifts down the cassette. That would be outward toward the smaller cogs on the rear cassette. This is something that kind of comes in handy if you're like, well, I wonder how I'm going to shift this hill. Should I be on the big chain ring or the small chain ring? Where should I be? That's going to be a good primer to kind of remember. Now, the final few things we'll say about learning to shift properly is 1, relax. It's not that big a deal. You can always turn around and go downhill or find a flat if you need to. The second thing is to keep that cadence up. Yes, your cadence is probably going to be around 80 or so when you first start riding. Really try to get it up. You can kind of get it up to around 100 and it's great. It makes it much more efficient and much easier to ride. The other thing is spend time on your bike. Yes, you can do some of this stuff on a bike trainer, but I promise you that it is not the same as being on a road. You will not know how to shift the same way. Once you've got shifting in your body and you know it very well, that's fine. Spend all the time on the trainers you want. But when you're learning, spend time outside. Thank you, Mo, so much for the question. It's a really important one, and I think that a lot of people probably just don't know about. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this episode of Ask Gurist. If you've got any questions, don't hesitate to email info@gurist.com or leave it right down there in the comments section below. As always, you can find us on all our social media outlets, which you can see right over here: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, my personal Strava right up the top. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel, which you can do so by clicking that YouTube button right over there. As always, don't forget to visit Gurist.com, where all our reviews live. You can check out everything we've ever done and let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you next time.